You're donning a uniform for your wedding. Shameful. That was the communication. 5 words from a contact I hadn't stored in years. But I recognized who it was. My father, retired Colonel Frank Holstead, former 82nd Airborne, full bird and eternally disappointed in his sole child. The message illuminated my phone just as I positioned myself behind the sealed chapel entrance, heart steady beneath my white navy dress uniform. The golden buttons shimmered. 4 stars on my shoulder. Rows of ribbons I'd earned, not accumulated, adorned my chest like quiet guardians of the past 25 years. Behind me, my squad stood at parade rest. Some wore medals I'd fastened to their uniforms myself. Others bore scars we never discussed, the type that didn't always bleed. And in front of me, just beyond those doors, 200 SEALs waited. So did the man I was about to wed. The message burned in my palm. I should have erased it. Instead, I gazed at it for a full minute, not in shock, but understanding. This is who he is, and this is who I've transformed into. The doors opened. As I stepped forward, heels crisp against polished wood. The SEALs, every single one of them, rose to their feet in perfect synchronization, and someone called out, "Admiral on deck." The chapel resonated with the sound of 200 decorated warriors snapping to attention, uniformed, upright, unshaken. My throat constricted, not from sorrow, from pride. My father wasn't here, but my family was. You probably want to understand what led to that moment, to me walking down the aisle, not in white lace, but in a uniform saturated with history, memory, and sacrifice. So, let me take you back. I was born into the military not by enrollment but by bloodline. My father believed in duty above all else. Discipline, honor, obedience. Those were his principles. And in his view, only sons were meant to carry that banner forward. When I was 10, he brought me to an Army-Navy game at the stadium, not to enjoy it, to demonstrate what I'd never become. He said it while standing beside me. "You'll never wear those colors, kid. Leave the uniform to men who can manage it." I didn't weep. I never did. Instead, I listened, observed, remembered. My room was decorated with medals he never permitted me to touch. I pressed his dress uniforms growing up, memorized every regulation before I was 16. But the moment I informed him I'd applied to Annapolis, he didn't speak to me for a year. The silence was louder than anything he could have voiced. When I was accepted, he dropped a manila folder on my bed. Inside applications to law schools, nursing programs, teaching positions. Not a single one with an anchor on the seal. At the Naval Academy, I learned quickly that being a woman in uniform meant walking a razor's edge twice as sharp, half as fair. I worked harder, studied longer, endured more. But I earned every bar. I rose through the ranks one steel moment at a time. And each time I was promoted, I called him. He never answered. Eventually, I stopped dialing, but the silence still spoke. Fast forward to the morning of my wedding. I wasn't nervous. I'd stood on foreign soil with mortars falling around me. This was just a ceremony. But the uniform, the one I wore that day, wasn't a statement. It was a truth. My fiancé James was a civilian, quiet, intelligent, grounded. He once told me, "You in uniform is the most honest thing I've ever witnessed. Why would I want you in anything else?" So, I wore white, just not his version of it. The plan was simple. A modest ceremony at the Naval Chapel. No bridesmaids, no frills, just us and the team. The SEALs I'd led, fought beside, and bled for. They showed up uninvited. Said it was non-negotiable. Said they couldn't let me walk alone. I didn't expect a crowd. I didn't expect tears. And I didn't expect that text. Shameful. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't say good luck. He said shameful. That was his gift to me. So I gave him mine. I walked down that aisle in a white uniform, 4 stars on my shoulder to the sound of 200 men saluting not my title but my life. That was the moment I knew blood didn't salute, but honor did. I grew up in a house where the American flag flew higher than feelings and where "I love you" was always implied but never spoken aloud. My father wasn't abusive. He was exact. Every inch of our lives was arranged like a parade formation. Meals at 1800 sharp, shoes lined at 45-degree angles, silence during 60 minutes every Sunday night. When I scraped my knee as a kid, he'd toss me an antiseptic wipe and say, "Soldiers don't complain." Even back then, I didn't mind. I admired him, respected him, wanted to be like him. That was my first mistake. Colonel Frank Holstead served 3 tours in Vietnam and never stopped reminding people of it. To his credit, he earned everything the hard way. Climbed from enlisted to officer, led men through jungles and ambushes. Bronze Star, Purple Heart. He kept the medals in a glass case in his study next to a black and white photo of him in dress greens, back straight, jaw tight. He called it the altar. I wasn't allowed to touch it, and I didn't until he made it clear I'd never be worthy of it. My mother, on the other hand, was gentle where he was stone. She taught literature at the local high school, wore flowing cardigans, and read me Emily Dickinson at bedtime. She called me her storm bird, wild, fierce, a little too strong for my own good. She was the only reason I didn't leave home the day I turned 18. I remember sitting between them at dinner once in high school. I'd received an award for a leadership program, and I told him I wanted to go to a summer boot camp in Annapolis. Mom beamed. My father didn't look up from his peas. "You're not cut out for the military. That's not how we build families." He said it like I was applying to join the circus. When I received my acceptance letter to the U.S. Naval Academy, I was 18 and trembling with joy. I brought it into the living room, held it out like a peace offering. Dad stared at it for a full 30 seconds, then said, "So, you're serious about this nonsense?" I told him I was. He didn't speak to me for 2 months after that. Not a word. He cancelled our standing Saturday breakfasts, skipped my graduation party. It was the first of many silences that would build a wall between us. But Mom never stopped trying. She called me every Sunday during my first year at Annapolis, sent care packages full of tea, granola bars, and annotated poetry. Once during my plebe summer, I broke down on the phone with her after a drill instructor had screamed in my face for a solid hour. She didn't cry. She just said, "Storms aren't meant to stay grounded. Let the wind harden you, not break you." She passed away 3 years later. Breast cancer, fast, cruel. Dad didn't even tell me she was in hospice until the final week. When I arrived, her hair was gone, her skin paper thin. He stood in the corner of the hospital room, arms crossed, saying nothing. She reached for my hand and whispered, "Keep flying." She was gone before sunrise. After her funeral, I returned to base. I expected a call, a letter, anything. Instead, I got an email from my father, 3 sentences. "The funeral was nice. I hope the Navy is treating you well. I still don't understand your decision." That was it. Over the years, every milestone in my career became a fork in the road, and he always turned the other way. When I pinned on Lieutenant Commander, I mailed him a photo. He didn't respond. When I received the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, I sent a copy of the ceremony link. Still nothing. At one point, I wondered if I should just give up, stop reaching out. But something in me kept hoping he'd show up. When I was promoted to Rear Admiral, the youngest woman in my command to reach that rank, I tried one last time. Sent him a handwritten note. Short. Direct. "I know you don't agree with my path, but I took your lessons, all of them, and I've led men and women with the same values you taught me. I've done it in uniform. I've done it well." I never got a reply, but I did hear through a mutual friend, one of his old army buddies, that he read the letter 3 times and tore it in half. So when I received that text on my wedding day, "You're wearing a uniform, shameful," it wasn't a surprise. It was a final confirmation. He never saw me as a soldier. He never saw me as a daughter, only as a defector. But here's the thing about legacy. It doesn't flow automatically through blood. It has to be earned. And somewhere along the way, I stopped chasing his approval. I built my own altar. And I filled it with the lives I'd led, protected, trained, and sometimes buried. That's what I carried with me down that aisle. Not shame, not resentment. Just truth. There's a saying in the Navy, smooth seas don't make skilled sailors. By that logic, I must have become a damn admiral in the perfect storm. I never set out to break records. I just didn't want to break. Not under pressure, not under fire, and especially not under judgment. After graduating from Annapolis, I was stationed in Okinawa. My first assignment wasn't glamorous. Paperwork, logistics, keeping men twice my size in line. Most figured I wouldn't last a year. I lasted 5. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but I paid attention. While others chased promotions, I chased excellence. Every time a door slammed shut, I learned the hinges. Every time I was underestimated, I took notes. There was a turning point, 2007, a classified operation off the Somali coast. One of our supply teams was ambushed during a recon run. 2 were injured, 1 trapped. I was a lieutenant commander at the time, technically not required to deploy boots on ground, but I went anyway. The situation turned fast. We were pinned behind rusted shipping containers, bullets chewing through steel like paper. One of our boys was bleeding out, his leg mangled below the knee. I dragged him 40 yards under fire, cinched a tourniquet with one hand and radioed medevac while my other hand held pressure on his femoral artery. By the time we reached the evac chopper, my uniform was soaked red and I'd taken 2 pieces of shrapnel through my side. I refused the stretcher. They called me Iceback after that. Said I bled ice, not blood. But I wasn't proud of the name. I was proud the kid lived. He still sends me a Christmas card every year. His daughter's name is Avery, after me. That was the moment command started to take notice. Suddenly, I was the exception. They said I had grit, leadership potential under pressure. But what they didn't see were the hours I spent in recovery, grinding my teeth through pain, teaching myself to walk without a limp. Pain never stopped me, but invisibility did. Even when I saved lives, someone else always got the headline. That's how it is when you don't fit the mold. But I learned to stop chasing spotlights. Instead, I became the lighthouse. By 2015, I was commanding training operations at Coronado. SEAL selection had its own politics, some of it ugly. I watched good candidates get washed out for the wrong reasons. So, I rewrote the training modules, quietly, thoroughly, implemented new safety protocols, mental resilience checkpoints, and recovery systems. Within a year, dropout rates dropped by 12%. Injury rates halved. I didn't get a medal for it, but I got something better, respect. Even the old brass started calling me, ma'am, with sincerity. And the men, the ones who mattered, they followed me without hesitation. When I made Rear Admiral, I received a standing ovation from my unit. The next morning, I checked my inbox. No email from my father. Not that I expected one, but later that week, I ran into one of his old West Point buddies at an event in D.C. He approached me, glass of bourbon in hand, and said, "Frank says the Navy is getting soft if they're promoting women like you." Then he smiled. "But he keeps your picture in his office. Won't admit it, though." That stung more than I wanted to admit. Love in silence still felt like absence. I kept rising. It didn't feel like a climb, more like a long uphill swim through cold, invisible currents. I served in South Korea, Bahrain, and eventually Norfolk. Everywhere I went, I left things better than I found them. People started calling me a quiet reformer. I preferred just officer. There was a moment, though, the one I can never shake. It was after a suicide on base. One of our brightest instructors. Quiet guy. Never missed a mark. No signs, no flags, just gone. I was the first to read his file. Tucked inside was a note. "Tell Admiral Holstead thank you. She's the only one who ever saw me. I didn't cry at first, but later that night, alone in my office, I pulled off my ribbons one by one and wept. Not from weakness, from the weight. After that, I made it policy. Every unit under my command would have mandatory monthly check-ins, no excuses. You didn't just train hard. You trained with eyes open to the people around you. It didn't make headlines, but it saved lives. That, to me, was real leadership. When the final promotion came, to full admiral, I was standing alone on the deck, watching sunrise over the water. The message arrived from Navy Personnel Command. 4 stars. No parade, no family, just the sky and silence. And that felt right, until a few days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address, handwritten. They're just making you a symbol. 5 words. My father's handwriting. It was the only thing he'd written to me in 15 years. Even in my highest moment, he couldn't help but try to reduce it, to shrink what he couldn't control. I burned the letter in the sink. Then I ironed my dress whites because I'd need them soon for a ceremony. My wedding. James wasn't military. He wasn't the type to shout orders or polish shoes until they reflected the soul. He didn't carry scars the way my team did, but he understood structure. And more importantly, he understood me. We met during a Department of Defense working group. He was a civilian intelligence analyst assigned to a cybersecurity task force I was overseeing. We collided over protocol during a briefing. He thought my reporting format was inefficient. I told him efficiency isn't always found in the fastest route. Sometimes it's found in clarity. He smiled, then revised his entire presentation overnight using my format. Said, "You were right. That was the beginning." James never once flinched when I got called away at 2 a.m. Never questioned why I couldn't talk about certain missions. Never made me feel like I had to downplay what I'd earned. Instead, he asked me things like, "How do you teach calm under chaos? How did it feel the first time someone called you Admiral?" He once told me, "Most people love parts of you. I love all of you. The steel and the softness, even the parts you try to carry alone." When he proposed, it wasn't with flash. No skywriters, no crowds, just the two of us on a pier at sunset, boots dangling over the edge. He opened a small, simple box and said, "Let me serve beside you wherever that means." I didn't cry. I just said yes. Planning the wedding was delicate. James didn't want a spectacle. Neither did I. But our friends, my team especially, insisted on something more meaningful than vows whispered in a courthouse. We decided on the Naval Chapel. Simple, formal, respectful. I didn't want a ball gown. He didn't want a tux. He wore a clean navy blue suit. I wore my white full dress uniform. It wasn't a political statement. It was personal. The only thing I've ever worn that felt like truth. A week before the wedding, I sent my father a card. Not out of hope, just out of completeness. Inside, I wrote, "I'm getting married this Saturday. 1,300 hours at the Naval Chapel. You're welcome to attend. I'll be in uniform." That was it. No RSVP ever came. The night before the wedding, James and I agreed to sleep separately, a tradition. He stayed with a close friend. I stayed on base in the guest quarters, quietly reviewing my ceremony notes. At midnight, I ironed my uniform. Slow, careful, reverent. As I passed the brass over the shoulder epaulets, my eyes welled. 4 stars. I'd worn them in combat, in strategy briefings, in moments of grief and command. But tomorrow I'd wear them for love. The morning arrived, clear and bright, that sharp navy blue sky you only get on the East Coast in spring. The SEALs showed up in formation outside the chapel. Some I hadn't seen in years. Men I'd trained, deployed with, pulled out of wreckage, delivered eulogies for their friends. No one told them to come. They just did. 15 minutes before the ceremony, I stood behind the chapel doors, flanked by 2 of my oldest team members, both retired, both now fathers, with gray in their beards. One leaned in and said, You walked us through hell. Let us walk you to something better. I was ready, peaceful, until the phone buzzed. I glanced down. A message from a number I hadn't saved but would never forget. You're wearing a uniform to your wedding. Disgraceful. No name, no congratulations, no apology for the silence of 2 decades. Just that. I should have felt anger. Instead, I felt something colder. Clarity. This was his final attempt to shame me back into the box I'd long outgrown. But shame requires agreement, and I no longer did. I tucked the phone into my pocket, smoothed my cuffs, took a deep breath, and when the chapel doors opened, every man in that room stood, not because they were told to, but because they chose to. A single voice rang out. Admiral on deck. The echo bounced off stained glass and polished wood. My heart didn't race. It settled. Because in that moment, surrounded by people who'd seen me at my fiercest, my most broken, my most human, I knew I wasn't walking toward tradition. I was walking into a truth I had forged from fire. I walked that aisle with steel in my spine. Not because I was trying to prove a point, but because I didn't have to. I had already become the point. The aisle felt longer than I expected. Not in the daunting, anxiety-inducing way most brides describe, but in the quiet, reverent sense of crossing a line from one life into another. My boots struck the floor in rhythm, crisp and even. And I didn't walk alone. To my left, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hill, a man who once pulled me from a downed helicopter in Kandahar. To my right, Senior Chief Torres, who'd lost a leg in Syria and still beat everyone in early morning PT runs. They were supposed to be guests. They insisted on being escorts. I saw James standing near the altar. He wasn't crying, but his eyes shimmered, and his hands were folded neatly behind his back, standing at ease, the way he knew I preferred. Behind him stood our officiant, a Navy chaplain I'd served with overseas. He wore his ribbons, too. We all did. No masks, no pretense, just the truth worn on our chests. As I approached, I caught sight of the pews. Rows and rows of service members, most in full dress, every seat filled. And as I stepped into the clearing before the altar, the room fell into perfect silence. Then, Admiral on deck, voices rang in unison. Every soldier, sailor, SEAL, and officer rose in one swift motion. Not for protocol, but for respect. My breath caught. Not because I needed validation, but because I hadn't realized until that very moment how long I'd gone without being seen. Fully, without hesitation, without caveat. These were warriors, men and women who'd faced death with me, who had trained under my command, who'd heard my voice in the heat of gunfire and followed it because they trusted it. They weren't just saluting a rank. They were saluting a life. I reached James and gave a small nod to Hill and Torres. They stepped back with silent dignity. The chaplain opened his binder, but waited. There was something sacred about the stillness. Then James stepped forward, took my hands, gloved, firm, and whispered, I don't need to say vows to know I'm already married to your courage. That's when I felt it. Not pride, belonging. Our vows were simple. We promised to serve each other, to protect not just each other's bodies, but each other's peace. To honor not just joy, but sacrifice. I didn't say, for richer or poorer. I said, when orders come, we follow together. When they don't, we find purpose on our own terms. James vowed to build a life with me that didn't ask me to dim, to carry the weight with me, to never ask me to be less. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the room didn't erupt. It stood still, quiet with reverence. Then came the applause, thunderous, earned, honest, the kind that fills the lungs, not the ears. We walked out under an arch of crossed sabers, blades gleaming in the spring light. A tradition usually reserved for officers. This time it was the enlisted who held the blades aloft. It meant more that way. They were the ones who truly knew. Later, at the reception, a modest affair on base, one of my former SEALs approached me. Big guy, tattooed forearms, rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. He looked down at my boots, then said, We never stood for you because of your rank, ma'am. We stood because you never made us feel small. Then he embraced me tight like a brother. I wasn't used to being held like that, not outside the battlefield, but I let myself accept it. Not because I needed comfort, because I had earned it. Around midnight, the crowd thinned. The cake had been cut. The toasts were over. I stepped outside to catch some air. The moon hung low over the waterline. James found me there, arms folded, watching the waves. He asked gently, "Did you hear from him?" I nodded. He waited. Then I said he called it shameful. James didn't react right away. Just stood beside me for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you believe that?" I looked down at my uniform, the gold trim, the ribbons, the stars. I thought about the SEALs rising to their feet, about the respect in their eyes, the quiet dignity of their salute. I looked back at James. "No," I said, "I don't. There are moments that define a life. Some come with medals, some with silence, some with a single text. But others, they come with a room full of warriors who don't have to stand, but do." It happened 3 days into our honeymoon. We were in Maine. James had found a quiet coastal inn, the kind with creaky floors and the smell of sea salt soaked into the walls. No press, no pomp, just us, foggy mornings, and blueberry pancakes made by someone's retired uncle named Roy. I hadn't looked at my phone since the ceremony. But that morning, James gently handed it to me. "You should see this." There was a message, not from my father, from my cousin Claire. A single photo, no caption. It was the parking lot of the chapel, taken from across the street. In the corner, unmistakable in his rigid posture, stood Colonel Frank Holstead, full dress uniform, arms crossed, back straight, watching, not entering. And then another photo. A moment later, the one that caught him mid-turn. Leaving. I stared at it longer than I expected. I didn't know what I was looking for. Regret, softness, closure. All I saw was a man who chose distance over redemption. James stood behind me, quiet, then said, "He came, but he still couldn't stand." That was when I knew. The moment 200 SEALs had saluted me, he had turned his back. Later that week, I received an invitation from the Pentagon. They were hosting a closed-door event, Leadership and Transformation Roundtable on the Future of Command. The brass wanted me to give a keynote on ethics in modern leadership. Not because I was the first woman admiral, but because I'd implemented systems that had actually saved lives. I almost said no. Then I remembered the young sailor who'd written me that suicide note. She's the only one who ever saw me. So I said yes. The night of the speech, I stood in full uniform under blinding lights in a room filled with ribbons and rank, politicians and power. I told stories of courage. Not mine, theirs, the warriors who followed orders into fire, not because they were told to, but because they trusted the one giving them. I talked about reform not as a threat, but a responsibility. I told the room, authority isn't about being the loudest voice. It's about being the calmest in the chaos. And then I closed with this. Respect isn't inherited. It isn't given by blood. It's earned by showing up, standing up, and doing right even when no one's watching. There was silence, then a standing ovation. The next morning, a letter arrived at my office. Handwritten, no return address, but I knew the script immediately. I didn't enter the chapel because I didn't know how to sit among people who saw in you what I refused to. I didn't salute, not because you didn't earn it, but because I no longer knew how to honor what I didn't understand. I was wrong. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk. No uniform, no protocol, just a father trying to understand a daughter he never took the time to know. Frank. I read it 3 times. Didn't cry, didn't burn it, just sat with it. James came home that evening and found me at the kitchen table. He raised an eyebrow. He finally said something. I nodded, handed him the letter. When he finished, he asked, "Do you want to meet him?" "I don't know," I said. "I don't owe him anything." "No," he said gently. But maybe you owe yourself the choice. The next week, I met him at Arlington. We stood at my mother's headstone, the grass trimmed, the silence absolute. He wore civilian clothes, slacks, jacket, no pins, no bars, no armor. Just a man, older, smaller than I remembered. I arrived in uniform, not to make a point, but because it was who I was. He didn't hug me, didn't try, just said, "You look like your mother when you stand like that." We talked, not about the war, not about medals, about grief, regret, how silence can feel like strength, but really just hides fear. Before we parted, he stepped back, straightened, and in a slow, deliberate motion, he saluted. Not a crisp military gesture, not perfect form, but earnest. And it landed harder than any medal I'd ever received. I returned the salute, not because he'd earned forgiveness, but because finally he'd chosen truth. That night, I lay beside James and whispered. He saluted. James didn't ask what it meant. He just held my hand, and we fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof. Some people think revenge is about destruction, but sometimes the most powerful reckoning is recognition. 6 months after the wedding, I received a call from Navy Personnel Command. They asked if I'd consider taking oversight of a new joint operations initiative, one designed to restructure inter-branch training protocols and integrate ethical command leadership. It was the kind of project I would have dreamed of 20 years ago. Now, it felt like legacy in motion. I accepted. And as part of the project, I returned to bases I hadn't stepped foot on in years, including the one where I'd first led a platoon of skeptical, stubborn sailors who thought I was just a publicity stunt. They remembered me, and they stood when I walked in. On one of those visits, I ran into a familiar name on the roster, Corporal Avery Patterson. I smiled. The little girl named after me, now in boots of her own. She told me she joined because her dad said I saved his life. Sometimes you don't realize how far your reach extends until it circles back and salutes you. Back at headquarters, I was approached about a civilian partnership with the Defense Education Initiative. They wanted to use my leadership methods to help train ROTC instructors across the country. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. When they asked me what to call the program, I said, "Call it the Salute Standard." Not for what's worn, but for what's earned. Then came the final letter. It arrived in late spring. Cream envelope, heavy cardstock, my name handwritten in block letters from my father. Inside, "I watched your speech. I've read your proposals. You built a career that wasn't about proving anyone wrong, including me. You built it to save lives. And I finally see that now. I missed the standing ovation, but I hope I haven't missed my chance to stand beside you, even in a small way. Dad." He included a single photo from my wedding, taken from a distance behind the last row of pews. I hadn't known someone had captured it. In the image, 200 men stand saluting. And in the back, a lone man, arms at his sides, watching. Not saluting. Not yet. Weeks later, I invited him to attend the ROTC keynote address. He came, sat in the back, said nothing. But afterward, as I stood outside shaking hands with cadets and instructors, he walked over, took off his cap, extended his hand. I took it. No cameras, no audience. Just the two of us. "I'm proud of you," he said. Then quieter, "And I'm sorry it took me so long." I nodded, not because it fixed everything, but because it started something. That night, James asked me, "Are you happy with how it turned out?" I thought about it for a long time. Then said, "I'm satisfied. Not because they suffered, but because real change happened. The buildings are safer, the program's stronger, the silence broken. And the girl who once ironed her father's uniform now has cadets ironing theirs because of what she built." He smiled and kissed the top of my head. "Would you ever forgive him?" he asked. I said, "Forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's a path." And today we took a step. 1 year to the day after my wedding, I stood on a stage accepting the Department of Defense's Excellence in Ethical Command Award. James was in the front row. So was my father. As I stepped to the podium, A group of cadets in white stood and saluted. And from the far right corner, so did Frank Holstead. This time with his hand to his brow. Afterward, as we walked out into the warm evening air, my phone buzzed. A message from one of the SEALs from my unit. Still thinking about your wedding day, ma'am. Never seen that many warriors cry during a ceremony. That was the day we realized something. Blood didn't salute, but we did. I looked at James, showed him the message. He nodded. You going to respond? I typed back. Some gifts can't be returned, but some salutes, they stay with you forever. Some people say revenge is about crushing what crushed you. But I've learned that the most lasting power is choosing to build what they never believed you could. You don't always have to swing back. Sometimes you just have to stand tall. Let them look up to reach you. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Who stood for you when others didn't? When did you rise above what was meant to break you? Leave a comment if you've ever turned betrayal into clarity and silence into your own kind of salute. And if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience, truth, and quiet triumph, please subscribe. We rise together.